Melee hunters have finally been nerfed to the ground. Shamans buffed massively again. Druid healers also receiving a buff, as well as rogue tanks getting a buff. Also boomkins getting a little bit of a damage buff, which should actually be a larger buff potentially in PvP. Let's break it all down and what it means right now. Now, if you didn't see it already, Nomergan, the bosses have ridiculous armor values obviously within the raid, and that has actually been addressed slightly. The increased armor value of certain mechanical bosses in Nomergan has been slightly reduced. This is specifically going to be Crowd Pummeler and Mecha Gear Thermoplug, who have ridiculously high armor. I think it's like 4,500, and that has been reduced by 10% to give physical damage a little bit of a increase. Now, if you were to look at those early bosses and the bosses that have the highest people doing the most damage with the current armor values, the ones that have reduced armor values already, it is warriors already on top, just being followed by one mage who's absolutely pumping, but warriors and melee hunters on those bosses that have low armor values. So if we saw a full nerf of armor values, you would absolutely see warriors take over and melee hunters being following that. Same thing on the other bosses, Viscous Fallout, warriors all on top being followed by melee hunters. Now, if you go to other bosses, we still have warriors doing very, very well, as well as melee hunters, but you definitely see a shift. If you go to Crowd Pummeler, it is literally only casters, warlocks, and mages, which means there's definitely needed to be tuned a little bit because this was unfair for melee DPS. They literally just can't compete on this fight. So these changes definitely make things a little bit more interesting as you get to the later fights within the raid. Definitely we're seeing warrior stonks go up today, but that's not the big change that actually happened. The hugest thing was a massive nerf to melee hunters, as well as a huge buff to enhance shamans. So let's break it down. If you actually go onto a hunter right now and you look at the dual wield specialization rune, you will notice that it says you get a 30% increased damage when wielding weapons of the same type. Basically, if I have two swords, my Raptor Strike will do 30% increased damage. That has been completely taken away. If I go to right here, that has been completely taken away. Dual wield specialization rune no longer grants 30% increased damage to Raptor Strike. What does this mean? How much of a nerf is this to hunters? Well, it actually comes as a second nerf to melee hunters this week. They already saw kind of like a 5 to 6% nerf earlier in this week. Now, this nerf will be something around 18% nerf if you're a survival melee hunter. If you are running the specialization that runs Lone Wolf, you're seeing about an 18% nerf. But if you are a Beast Mastery hunter, you're seeing about 11% nerf. This is again on top of the nerf we already saw earlier this week for about 6% damage. Now, another 11 to 18% nerfed on melee hunters. And I just got done having a full breakdown and conversation with the world's top 2 hunters right now, Zatara and Tree Ranger. I'll have Zatara's link to his Twitch in the description. It is Eben down in the description, but both of these hunters have been absolutely pumping, and we had a full breakdown of what you can do, what this means, how you can actually continue pumping in the raid. But if you were to look at one of the fights, let's look at, I don't even want to look at the first fight because the first fight, it was better already to be a Beast Mastery hunter. But if we look at a fight like Electrocutioner and you were to look at Raptor Strike damage, Raptor Strike here doing about 60% of your damage. So you are seeing a raw 30% damage nerf to an ability doing 60% of your damage. And so I would expect this week to start seeing melee hunters be kind of below right here above Ellie Shamans or Priests. If we go to actually the max percentile, it sees where the classes are actually going to kind of perform realistically towards the end of the phase at the top level. And so this is what it's gonna look more like as we keep getting faster fights and people get more gear, where it's gonna be warriors above. Well, warriors actually got some stonks. They got actually a little bit closer to warlocks, but warlocks will still continue rising, as well as fire mages. And then we saw crazy buffs for enhancement shamans, and so I would anticipate melee hunter will be a little bit down here. But let's talk about those enhancement shaman buffs. So earlier this week, enhancement shamans got, from my understanding, and you can correct me in the comments, around 30 to 40% buff to their damage. Now, this made enhancement shaman tanks just incredibly powerful. If you look at the top range of tanks, they they're by far doing the most damage, using almost 900 DPS from an enhancement shaman on this fight. The most damage. They have insane threat already, probably unmatched threat. The only thing that's close to them is going to be the actual warlock tanks. So they actually take the least amount of damage. So the enhancement shamans have amazing AoE threat, but their stonks are just so high, especially for tanks. They are potentially the strongest tanks in the game, and they just received another buff of 20% attack power. That's right, Spirit of the Alpha rune now gains or grants the shaman an extra 20% increased attack power if they cast the spell on a target that is not themselves. So you can just toss on Spirit of the Alpha on your healers, and you will now have an increase of 20% attack power. That is pretty strong. Now, two-handed mastery rune also gets an increase of 10% attack power and 10% chance to hit with spells after hitting with the two-hander. That is really nice. It helps out for two-handers to be able to be viable in more situations. Also for your instant casts of like chain lightning or anything like that, you will have an actual chance of hitting with it because you're missing out on some hit from not having the dual wield specialization rune. Now, shamanistic rage also now grants 5% of the shaman's actual mana back per second instead of scaling with your attack power, spell power, or healing power. This is just raw 5% mana per second back from shamanistic rage. That's very nice for shamans. They're the major winners today. Earth Shield did have its mana cost reduced. The amount of abilities that can proc from it went from 3 to 9, so that it's more charges, and it actually heals for more, about 50% higher at level 40. Earth Shield is now actually going to be viable. Now, Power Surge and Ancestral Guidance also were buffed, and Ancestral Guidance had its cooldown reduced by 1 whole minute. It was 2 minutes down to 1 minute, and Power Surge technically just got reworded where the rune grants mana every 5 seconds, equal to 15% of the shaman's intellect. So there are some issues apparently that are happening with MP5 things, but that should be fixed now. So shamans, major winners, and you'll definitely see them shoot up even higher, as this list was only warlocks and maybe 1 rogue here in the top 100 for tanks, and maybe a couple paladins, although paladins aren't really getting some love. We're definitely seeing the stonks of Horde go way up here. Now, paladins had the Crusader Strike reworked so that Crusader Strike now deals holy damage instead of normal physical damage, although it still counts as physical damage. This will make it ignore some of the armor on bosses, or just ignore boss's armor in general. This is really nice for some rep paladins, but is it enough? It potentially might not be, because right below that is Seal of the Martyrdom, can no longer trigger Art of War and will no longer be triggered by Frost Oil or other weapon procs. That's a bug fix technically, but it's also a nerf. You know what it is? It's also a nerf. So that, paladins, you can tell me in the comments if this feels good or if it is a little bit of leaving you behind, while shamans are kind of soaring, taking off. Enhanced shamans definitely needed the love. They were definitely one of the weaker classes, and they absolutely got massively buffed this week. And I know you're all expecting some buffs for those classes that are underperforming. That would be ranged hunters, whose only class that is below them are literally frost mages. Rogues are underperforming, feral druids underperforming, and boomkins underperforming massively compared to everything else. Well, lo and behold, rogues did get buffed. That's right, the ability called Redirect that allows you to change where your combo points on is actually massively better. So Redirect will no longer trigger a global cooldown. No more GCD from Redirect, and its cooldown itself was reduced all the way to 10 seconds. This will be much more useful, and it's a lot more useful in PvP. This is a very nice change for rogues, but it kind of buffs them more so in PvP than PvE. What about their PvE viability? Well, don't worry about it. They actually had the buff to Main Gushi. Main Gushi now generates 3 combo points, and it also had its base energy dropped to 15. Now you might be thinking, that's just for tank rogue. What about DPS rogue? Don't worry guys, because just a flesh wound, the other tank talent, had its threat bonus increased. That will basically increase the rogue tank's threat by about 30%. Rogue tanks have been buffed. Are you better than shamans or warlocks? No. but you're pretty viable. Rogue tanks are really, really solid. So if you are struggling to find a group as a rogue, I would suggest going tank. And if you are not inviting rogue tanks because they're rogues, don't do that anymore, because rogue tanks are actually really good. All right, now let's look at the changes to druids who got buffed if you are a resto druid or a balanced druid. Life Bloom's mana cost was reduced by 50%, and Life Bloom now refunds half of the base mana cost per stack when it expires or is dispelled. The mana efficiency of resto druid has been enhanced significantly with the changes today. Now, Living Seed will heal for 50% of the critical heal that was planted with the seed. It was 30%, so that's a very large buff. This new heal now blooms from non-periodic healing and in addition to any damage taken. This is a really nice thing. And Nourish had its mana cost reduced by 27%. These boost up the value of resto druids on those longer fights pretty significantly. Mana efficiency is going to be really nice for them. And on top of that, what if you wanted to do something like potentially heal and do damage at the same time? Because you know shamans can like heal hands. Don't worry, Fury of the Storm Rage is now allowing you to cast that instant cast healing touch, and it can now be cast in all shape-shifting forms. This means you can be in bear form or cat form and keep pumping and just mouse over cast a heal, or if you're leveling, this helps you out while leveling where you don't have to waste a ton of mana by shifting out of form and back in. You can heal instantly while staying in form. This would be a really nice change for pretty much all druids. Now, Moonkins did see a buff because they are significantly underperforming, slightly higher than feral druids, but still underperforming if you look at all of the other classes. And the first one is that Moonkin form now reduces the mana cost of Moonfire by 50% and increases the periodic damage of Moonfire by 50%. This also means Sunfire was buffed by both of those differences. That just means you can dot things for harder. Now, how much of a DPS increase is it? It's not going to be crazy within the raid, but it definitely is going to be seen in PvP. Like, you're going to definitely notice ticking down pretty quickly in PvP. And as a quality of life, Moonkins can now cast a lot of their spells without having to leave Moonkin form. This is going to be things that aren't directly heals, things like remove curse, remove poison, abolish poison, innervate, rebirth, revive, mark of the wild, and gift of the wild. I can't believe I actually got all of those right on the first try. That was like my first try, and I'm dyslexic, so I'm more proud about that than anything else in this video. That Moonkins, you're a little bit happy. Now, of course, after seeing the nerfs, everybody took to Twitter, including myself, okay? Don't judge me, I wanted to rant. And after seeing the massive nerfs to Melee Hunter, I made a joke on Agrin's post, and he said, here's what looks like next week's adjustments. Normal disclaimer though, and this is really, really important, just because your class or spec didn't see changes this week, it does not mean it is off of their radar. It does not mean they have abandoned you. They're trying to fix some of the issues within the game with incremental changes, and they're trying to make the changes early enough within the phase so that if someone were to fully re-roll, they wouldn't have a full issue of being able to like play their class. Now, of course, I made a joke, and the entire community is kind of, you can notice that the Hunter nerfs are very, very strong. And we all saw that Hunter tuning was coming, but it was very, very, very strong. But Agrin's response to this pointed out that it should be, at least for BM Hunters, around a 10% nerf in PvE. Now, technically, 11% to 18% is what we're seeing, but at the very top end, I will say at the very top end, this is a much larger nerf because of if you had really good RNG and really good crits, it nerfs you a lot more than that. But realistically, in BM spec, it is around a 10 to 11% nerf, and you won't be able to really have the variance of being able to choose between being a lone wolf survival hunter or being a BM hunter that's meleeing. You will have to be a melee BM hunter. Ranged hunter, still completely dead. You have to be a BM melee hunter. It won't be a dead class, but it definitely is a nerf. He points out that we can still expect hunters to be actually pretty strong overall in PvE, even without these adjustments or with these adjustments. So it is not all doom and gloom. And he also points out that it won't be too long until the next phase again, and everything gets flipped on its head. This is all part of the ride, and they do need to do these class tunings early on in a phase before people really really re-roll and kind of commit everything to one of the classes. So my big takeaway from today's nerfs, buffs, and everything are that Melee Hunter, yes, you got a huge nerf today. Now, is the class dead? No. In your average group, in your normal raid, Melee Hunters will still significantly overperform pretty much everyone except for your Warlocks and your Mages. Those classes are just shooting through the roof. But most Warriors will be way lower than your Melee Hunters. Most of every other class will be way lower than your Melee Hunters still. You just need to go BM spec. It is not the end of the class. It is not the end of the world. Shaman stonks way up. Shaman stonks this week have gone crazy. If you're an enhanced shaman, you are the happiest you could have ever been. This was the best week that could have happened for you for this phase. So shamans are looking phenomenal. So that is now one of the top classes. Warrior stonks have gone up a little bit as well as any other melee class did get a little bit of a break with their damage to 2 bosses in particular. Now, Resto Druids also feeling pretty solid, but these are definitely the changes we're seeing, pretty big ones, much bigger than we saw last week, to all of the classes. And if you want to see the full conversation breakdown I did about the changes and as well as just ways to min-max on a Melee Hunter, I know there's a lot of RNG. The rotation is a lot of RNG. There's a lot of things you can do outside of that. There's a lot of nuance. I did break everything down with Zatara and Tree Ranger, so thank you to them for being on the stream, and that will be live on YouTube either later tonight or tomorrow morning, so make sure to check that out. And from there, I'm off for the weekend, so I'll see you guys all on Monday, and I'll try to keep you updated on any other changes that happen. But let me know in the comments if you feel like this was too much, too heavy-handed, if other classes in particular need some changes, and what can be done, what can make this phase better. I'm genuinely very curious, so let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys all on the next one.